They didn't just rewrite history, they buried it, sometimes literally under 10 feet of mud, rubble, and silence. Across 6 continents, archaeologists have unearthed something that doesn't fit the official story. Bones of beings that stood 10, 12, even 15 feet tall. Ancient texts from Sumeria, the Bible, Hindu scripture, and Native American oral tradition all describe the same thing: towering beings who lived among men. And yet, official science says they never existed. So who ordered the Smithsonian to confiscate and destroy giant skeletal remains in the 1800s? Why do thousands of historical buildings across Europe and America show architectural proportions far too large for ordinary humans? And what exactly was the Tartarian Empire, a vast, technologically advanced civilization that maps confirm existed? And why has it been scrubbed from modern history books? This is not conspiracy. This is archaeology, cartography, and mythology converging on one uncomfortable answer.
Pull out any atlas printed before 1850, and you will find something that stops you cold. Right there, sprawled across the northern expanse of Asia and stretching deep into Europe and the Pacific, a single empire so massive it dwarfs every other civilization on the map. It is not labeled Rome. It is not labeled China. The name printed across that enormous landmass in the careful hand of the greatest cartographers who ever lived is Tartaria. Abraham Ortelius, the Flemish geographer who produced the world's first modern atlas in 1570, shows it clearly. Gerardus Mercator, the man whose map projection we still use today, shows it. Joan Blau, the Dutch master cartographer of the 1600s, whose maps were considered the most accurate documents of their age, shows it. These were not fringe map makers. These were not conspiracy theorists scratching wild theories onto parchment. These were the most respected scientific minds of the Renaissance and early modern period, and every single one of them drew the same empire, occupying the same territory across 5 centuries of cartographic history. And then, somewhere between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, it simply disappears. Not gradually, not through a slow process of rediscovery or renaming, it vanishes from maps, from textbooks, from academic curriculum, from the entire architecture of officially taught world history. A civilization that cartographers once identified as the largest on Earth evaporates from the historical record so completely that most people alive today have never once heard its name. You could walk into any university history department in the Western world and ask about the Tartarian Empire, and the most likely response you would receive is a blank stare or a polite dismissal. That alone should disturb you. At its documented peak, Tartaria spanned from Eastern Europe across the whole of Siberia and into the Pacific coast of Asia, an expanse of land that made the British Empire look modest by comparison. Historical records reference multiple distinct regions operating under the Tartarian designation: Russian Tartaria in the north, Chinese Tartaria to the east, independent Tartaria across the central steppes. This was not one homogeneous culture, but a vast, interconnected civilization with regional expressions and a shared foundational identity that historians of the era took entirely seriously. So what happened? How does the largest empire in recorded cartographic history get quietly folded away like an embarrassing family secret? The answer, when you begin to pull at it, does not lead to a simple story of conquest or assimilation. It leads somewhere far more uncomfortable, toward evidence of a deliberate historical reset, a rewriting of the human timeline so thorough and so coordinated that the Tartarian Empire became little more than a ghost, haunting the margins of maps that most people never think to examine. This is where the story of the giants begins, because Tartaria was not just an empire, it was a foundation, and someone worked very hard to make sure you would never build on it. Stand inside the main hall of any major 19th century government building, the kind that exists in every major city across Europe, Russia, and North America, and pay attention to something most people never notice. Look up. The ceilings soar 40, 50, 60 feet above your head. The doorways are twice the height they need to be. The windows begin at a level that would require an ordinary human being to climb just to reach the sill. The columns flanking the entrance are so massive that 3 grown adults holding hands could not wrap their arms around a single one. Every proportion, every measurement, every architectural decision screams the same wordless question: who exactly was this built for? The standard explanation is aesthetic. Grandeur, they say, intimidation, the expression of state power through scale. And perhaps that satisfies you the first time you hear it. But walk through enough of these buildings, in enough countries, across enough centuries of supposed construction, and the aesthetic argument begins to collapse under its own weight. Because the proportional anomaly is not occasional, it is everywhere, it is consistent, and it predates the governments that now occupy these structures by a margin that mainstream history has never adequately explained. This is where the mud flood theory enters, and it is not as fringe as the name might suggest. Across hundreds of cities worldwide, researchers and independent investigators have documented a phenomenon hiding in plain sight. The ground floors of thousands of historical buildings are buried, not damaged, not demolished, buried, with their windows now sitting at street level, their original entrances swallowed by earth, and their lower stories accessible only through excavation. St. Petersburg, Chicago, Prague, San Francisco, the pattern repeats itself across continents with a geographical consistency that random accumulations simply cannot explain. The theory holds that a catastrophic event, whether a coordinated demolition, a natural cataclysm, or a deliberate civilizational burial, deposited enormous quantities of earth and debris across these cities within a remarkably short window of time. The populations that emerged afterward were handed a truncated world, inheriting buildings they did not build, institutions they did not found, and a history retrofitted to explain structures whose true origins had been sealed beneath their feet. What gets buried along with those lower floors is proportion, the full scale of the original architecture. Because if you restore these buildings to their complete height, if you add back the stories swallowed by the mud, the proportions stop being merely grand and start being something else entirely. They start being sized for inhabitants that no current anthropological model accounts for. Tartarian architecture was not built to impress ordinary humans. The scale encoded into its stonework tells a different story, one of builders and occupants whose physical reality required dimensions that our bodies simply do not. The cities were not monuments to human ambition, they were homes, and the beings who lived in them were nothing like us.
In the second half of the 19th century, something extraordinary began happening with startling regularity across the American continent. Farmers breaking new ground, miners blasting through rock, and railway workers cutting paths through untouched earth kept pulling up the same impossible thing: human skeletons of extraordinary size. Not slightly larger than average, not the kind of variation you might attribute to an unusually tall individual. These were skeletal remains measuring 7, 8, 9, and in documented cases over 11 feet in length, accompanied by skulls so large that a grown man could fit the cranium over his own head like a helmet. The reports are not rumor, they are newspaper record. The New York Times, the Smithsonian's own annual reports, and dozens of regional publications throughout the 1800s documented these discoveries with the matter-of-fact tone of routine archaeological reporting. Giants unearthed in Wisconsin burial mounds, double-rowed teeth and elongated skulls recovered from Ohio earthworks, skeletal remains of enormous stature pulled from the ground in Minnesota, Arizona, and along the banks of the Mississippi. The geographical spread alone is staggering. This was not one anomalous site, but a pattern blanketing an entire continent. And it was not confined to America. In Patagonia, at the southern tip of South America, Spanish explorer Ferdinand Magellan's own expedition logs from 1520 describe encounters with a people so tall that the heads of his crew reached only to their waists.
Turkish archaeological sites and ancient Greek burial grounds have surrendered oversized remains that classical historians, writing long before modern academic gatekeeping existed, simply recorded as evidence of the giant races their own mythologies had always described. Then came the Smithsonian. In 1916, a congressional inquiry produced documents, still accessible to those who know where to look, indicating that the Smithsonian Institution had systematically collected and subsequently destroyed thousands of giant skeletal remains recovered across North America. The stated justification shifted depending on who was asked. The bones were fragile, they were misidentified, they were not scientifically significant. But the pattern underlying every justification was identical. The physical evidence disappeared, and what replaced it was institutional silence. Whistleblower accounts from former Smithsonian employees and field archaeologists have since described a deliberate protocol. Remains above a certain size threshold were flagged, collected under federal authority, and removed from any chain of public documentation. Not studied, not preserved, removed. The archaeology of an entire category of human history was quietly nationalized and then quietly erased. What makes this suppression so difficult to dismiss is not any single account or any single document, it is the pattern. Across independent discoveries, across multiple countries, across more than a century of archaeological work, the same sequence repeats. Giants are found, giants are reported, institutions intervene. Evidence vanishes, and the official record moves forward as though nothing was ever in the ground to begin with. The bones existed. The question was never whether they were found. The question is who decided you were never supposed to know.
There's a dismissal that happens the moment you introduce mythology into a historical argument. Eyes glaze, the word legend gets deployed like a shield, and the conversation gets quietly steered back toward what academia considers solid ground: pottery shards, carbon dating, peer-reviewed journals. But consider for just a moment what it actually means when every human civilization on Earth, separated by vast oceans and thousands of years, tells the same story. Not a similar story, not a story with vague thematic overlap, the same story, populated by the same beings describing the same sequence of events, using different names in different languages across every corner of the inhabited world. The Hebrew Bible calls them the Nephilim, sons of God who descended, took human wives, and produced offspring of extraordinary size and power. The Book of Numbers describes them as beings beside whom the Israelite scouts felt like grasshoppers. The Book of Enoch, older still and deliberately excluded from the canonical Bible, dedicates entire chapters to these beings, their physical description, their knowledge, their corruption of early humanity, and their ultimate destruction. This is not metaphor dressed in ancient clothing. The authors of these texts were making claims they believed to be literal and historical. Travel east to the river valleys of ancient Sumeria, and the story does not change, it only gains detail. The Anunnaki, as the Sumerian tablets describe them, were beings who came from elsewhere, who possessed knowledge that dwarfed human understanding and whose physical stature placed them in an entirely different category from the people who recorded their existence. The Epic of Gilgamesh, among the oldest written narratives on Earth, describes its hero as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, towering over ordinary men, built on a scale that the text treats not as exaggeration, but as biological fact. The Greeks called them titans and giants. The Hindu Puranas named them the Daityas and Asuras, primordial beings of immense power who warred with gods and shaped the early earth. Across North America, from the Paiute of the Great Basin to the Choctaw of the Southeast, indigenous oral traditions speak with remarkable consistency of a race of red-haired giants who inhabited the land before them. Beings who were eventually defeated, destroyed, or driven out, leaving behind only the memory encoded in stories passed down through generations who understood exactly what they were preserving. The convergence is the evidence.
When you strip away the names, the cultural framing, and the theological overlays, what remains across every one of these traditions is identical in its core claim that before the world as we know it took shape, beings of extraordinary physical stature and advanced capability walked this earth alongside early humans. Mythology was never mankind's attempt to explain what it could not understand. It was mankind's most durable technology for preserving what it was not allowed to forget. The giants were real, and every culture on Earth, independently and collectively, never stopped saying so.
The question that follows naturally from their existence is not simply whether giants were real. That ground has been covered in the bones, in the texts, in the convergent memory of every civilization that ever rose to sufficient complexity to record what it knew. The more unsettling question is what life actually looked like when they were here. What was the texture of that world? What did it mean on an ordinary day in the ancient human experience to exist alongside beings who made you feel, as the Israelite scouts so plainly put it, like a grasshopper? The archaeological record, read without the filter of conventional assumption, offers answers that are as coherent as they are uncomfortable. Petroglyphs carved into rock faces across the American Southwest, the Sahara, and the valleys of Central Asia depict human figures in unmistakable proportion to other beings standing beside them. Beings whose rendered height dwarfs the humans around them, not through artistic stylization, but through the same careful proportional logic these ancient artists applied to everything else they drew. These were not gods floating in the sky above human scenes. They were rendered as physically present, grounded, inhabiting the same terrestrial space as the smaller figures beside them. Ancient Sumerian cylinder seals, some of the oldest recorded visual art in human history, show similar scenes. Tall figures presiding over smaller ones, oversized hands guiding human activity, a hierarchy expressed not through symbolic elevation, but through literal physical scale. And the oral traditions that accompany these images are consistent in what they describe. The giants taught. They organized, they directed the construction of things that early humans, left entirely to their own devices, could not have conceived or executed alone. This reframes everything. The enduring mystery of how ancient peoples moved stones weighing hundreds of tons, achieved astronomical alignments of breathtaking precision, or constructed hydraulic and architectural systems that engineers today struggle to fully reverse engineer, these stop being mysteries the moment you allow for the presence of a physically and intellectually superior race operating alongside early humanity. The question was never how primitive people built impossible things. The question was always who was standing beside them when they did it. The relationship was not one of equals. Every tradition that preserves the memory of this coexistence describes a dynamic of authority. Giants as rulers, as priests, as the originators of law and agriculture and sacred knowledge. Early humans did not live beside giants the way neighbors live beside each other. They lived the way a civilization lives under a founding influence, shaped at the root level by the priorities, the architecture, and the cosmology of beings whose reality set the parameters of everything that followed. We have been taught to think of ancient humanity as a story of slow, solitary progress, our ancestors pulling themselves upward through darkness by sheer ingenuity alone. But the record suggests something far more complex. We did not build the ancient world by ourselves, and the shadow cast by those who stood beside us never fully lifted. It simply got a different name. Every great question in this investigation eventually arrives at the same wall. If they were here, if the civilization was real and the beings were physical and the evidence was as abundant as the historical record suggests, then what happened to them? Not what happened over centuries of gradual decline, the way empires typically exhaust themselves into irrelevance.
But what happened suddenly enough that an empire spanning half the globe and a race of beings documented across every inhabited continent could be reduced, within what appears to be a remarkably compressed window of time, to buried ruins and suppressed memory? The geological record, when you approach it without the comfortable assumptions of uniformitarianism, the academic doctrine that change happens slowly and incrementally, tells a story of violence. Ice cores extracted from Greenland and Antarctica preserve atmospheric snapshots of the past, and what they show at certain historical thresholds is not gradual transition, but sudden, catastrophic shift. Temperature drops of extraordinary magnitude occurring not over millennia, but over decades. Ash layers indicating volcanic or extraterrestrial events of global consequence. And in the sedimentary record across multiple continents, a layer of burned, compressed earth dating to a period that aligns disturbingly well with the proposed collapse of the Tartarian Empire and the disappearance of the giant races from active historical documentation. Plasma event theory, drawn from the work of researchers in the field of electric universe cosmology, proposes that the Earth periodically passes through regions of space dense enough with electromagnetic charge to trigger atmospheric discharge events of unimaginable scale. Essentially, lightning storms of planetary proportion capable of leveling surface civilizations while leaving underground geology largely intact. It sounds extraordinary until you examine the vitrified stone fortresses of Scotland and the fused sand fields of the Libyan desert, where silica has been melted into glass by temperatures that no known natural fire source can produce, and no conventional military technology of the ancient world could have generated. Pole shift theory offers a different but equally catastrophic mechanism, a rapid reorientation of the Earth's rotational axis, triggered by internal geological pressure or external gravitational influence, producing tidal waves of continental scale, burying coastal and lowland civilizations under sediment deposits of precisely the depth and consistency that the mudflood evidence documents. Charles Hapgood, a mainstream academic whose pole shift research was corresponded upon and cautiously endorsed by Albert Einstein, established the geological basis for this possibility decades before it was absorbed into alternative history circles. What all of these mechanisms share is the same essential outcome: a civilizational reset so total and so swift that the survivors inherited a broken world with no living memory of what had stood before. The giants, whatever ultimately brought them down, did not decline, they were interrupted. The Tartarian Empire was not conquered in the conventional sense, it was erased by something operating at a scale beyond any human army's capacity to deliver. The catastrophe was real. The only remaining argument is which instrument of destruction the Earth, or something beyond it, chose to use.
There is a version of this story where the suppression is accidental, where the giants were lost to institutional incompetence, where the Tartarian Empire faded from maps through simple cartographic convention, where the bones disappeared due to poor preservation protocols and underfunded museums making difficult storage decisions. That version is comfortable. It requires no coordinated intent, no institutional motive, no deliberate hand guiding what humanity is and is not permitted to remember. It asks nothing difficult of you, and it collapses completely the moment you examine the timeline. Modern archaeology did not emerge gradually from centuries of curious human excavation. It was formalized, institutionalized, and given governmental authority within a remarkably narrow window of time, the mid to late 1800s. Precisely the same decades when giant skeletal discoveries were being reported with their highest frequency across North America and Europe. The Smithsonian Institution was founded in 1846. The Archaeological Institute of America was established in 1879. The systematic academic frameworks that would define what counted as legitimate historical evidence, who had authority to collect and classify it, and what conclusions were permissible to draw from it, all of it crystallized within the same generation that was simultaneously pulling anomalous bones from the ground at an unprecedented rate. That is not coincidence. That is infrastructure being built around a problem.
The founding philosophies of modern anthropology are equally telling. The discipline emerged with a specific mandate: to construct a linear, progressive narrative of human development that moved in one direction only, from primitive to complex, from ignorant to enlightened, from stone tools to civilization. Any evidence suggesting that the trajectory had been interrupted, reversed, or that a more advanced civilization had preceded the one now in power was not merely inconvenient. It was structurally incompatible with the entire academic framework being erected. The institutions did not suppress the evidence because they were evil. They suppressed it because their foundational assumptions left them no other available response. Governments had their own motivations operating in parallel. A civilization that predated existing nation-states and whose architectural legacy was physically embedded in the cities those governments now occupied raised questions about ownership, authority, and legitimacy that no emerging imperial power was prepared to answer honestly. If the buildings your government occupies were built by a civilization you have no historical connection to, the claim of continuity that justifies your authority becomes extraordinarily fragile. So ask the hardest question directly. If everything documented across these sections were true, if giants walked this earth, if Tartaria spanned half the globe, if the reset was real and the evidence was deliberately buried, would the institutions currently controlling the flow of historical knowledge allow you to know? Would the same bodies that classified the Smithsonian correspondence, that hold warehouses of unexamined archaeological material, that fund the academic careers of every researcher working within their framework, would they volunteer the truth? History has always been written by whoever controls the archive. The more important question is, who decided what never got filed?
They could bury the bones. They could confiscate the records, redraw the maps, restructure the academic disciplines, and control the institutions. What they could not do, what no cover-up, however coordinated, has ever managed to accomplish, is move the stones. And the stones are still there, sitting in plain sight on every continent, defying every conventional explanation with the same silent, immovable patience they have maintained for thousands of years. Begin at Baalbek in the mountains of modern Lebanon, where the Roman temple complex everyone photographs sits atop a foundation platform that the Romans themselves did not build and never claimed to have built. Beneath the classical columns and familiar imperial architecture lies a base layer of megalithic stonework so massive it has no parallel in any known construction tradition on Earth. The largest individual stone in that foundation, the stone of the pregnant woman, weighs approximately 1,200 tons. A second nearby stone weighs an estimated 1,650 tons. A third, discovered more recently, still buried in the adjacent quarry, approaches 1,800 tons. No crane system in operation today could lift these stones and place them with the precision they currently display. The Romans, with all their formidable engineering capability, built on top of this platform because they had no more understanding of who constructed it than we do. They simply inherited it and were grateful for the foundation. Move east and north to Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, where a site carbon dated to approximately 12,000 years ago, predating Stonehenge by 7 millennia and the Egyptian pyramids by 8, presents carved megalithic pillars of extraordinary sophistication, arranged in precise astronomical alignment. The conventional model of human history at that date describes our ancestors as nomadic hunter-gatherers without the social organization, the surplus resources, or the architectural knowledge to construct anything remotely approaching what Göbekli Tepe represents. And yet there it stands, not as a primitive scratching in the earth, but as a complex, intentional, technically demanding achievement that was deliberately buried by its builders when they were finished with it, as though they understood that what they were sealing away needed to be preserved beyond whatever they knew was coming.
The Bosnian pyramids, still contested by mainstream archaeology with a defensiveness that itself invites scrutiny, present a formation of hills whose internal tunnels, geometric angles, and electromagnetic properties align more convincingly with constructed pyramidal architecture than with any known geological formation process. And across Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia, the star forts, those extraordinary geometric fortifications with their perfectly symmetrical pointed bastions, whose design appears fully formed across dozens of countries with no documented evolutionary development, bear the same Tartarian architectural fingerprint pressed into the landscape of every civilization that came after the reset. These structures are not mysteries because they are inexplicable. They are mysteries because the explanation they point toward is one that the official record is not yet prepared to accommodate. Someone was here before us. They were capable than we have been told. And they built in stone, precisely because stone survives floods, survives plasma events, survives pole shifts, survives cover-ups, and waits without urgency for the moment when enough people finally stop looking away.
Everything brought forward across this investigation was always pointing toward a single unified conclusion, not a theory, not a fringe proposition whispered in the margins of the internet, but a coherent and evidentially supported reframing of the human story from its very foundation. The Tartarian Empire was real. It appears on the most authoritative maps produced by the most respected cartographers of the Renaissance and early modern period, and its disappearance from the historical record is not the result of scholarly reassessment, but of systematic erasure executed with institutional precision. The giants were real. Their bones were pulled from the earth on multiple continents, documented in newspapers and government reports, and then methodically removed from public access by organizations whose founding timeline aligns too perfectly with the suppression to be explained by anything other than intent. The cataclysm was real. The geological record preserves its fingerprint in ice cores, sediment layers, vitrified stone, and the buried ground floors of thousands of buildings across the civilized world. And the cover-up was real, constructed not in shadow but in plain sight, through the architecture of academic institutions, governmental authority, and the slow, patient management of what humanity is permitted to call history. What makes this convergence so difficult to dismiss is precisely what makes it so difficult to accept. It is too consistent. Independent discoveries on separate continents point to the same beings. Mythological traditions with no contact with each other describe the same events. Physical structures built according to the same impossible specifications appear in cultures with no documented connection. The suppression follows the same playbook in country after country, institution after institution, decade after decade. Coincidence does not produce this kind of pattern. Pattern produces pattern. And this one has been hiding in plain sight, encoded in stone and scripture, and the careful hand of cartographers who simply drew what they knew to be true. The world before the reset was not primitive. It was not a darkness from which our current civilization rescued humanity through the slow progress of reason and industry. It was something else entirely, something larger, older, and more architecturally and cosmologically sophisticated than anything our current timeline of human development has room to accommodate. And the beings who inhabited that world alongside early humans left behind not just bones and buildings, but an imprint on the deepest layer of human memory, preserved in every mythology, every sacred text, every oral tradition that refused to let the giants become merely metaphor. You were never meant to find your way back to this. The institutions were built to prevent exactly this kind of synthesis, this kind of pattern recognition, this kind of refusal to accept the official story as the complete story. But the evidence was never fully destroyed. It was buried in quarries, in museum basements, in congressional documents, in the lower floors of cities, in the bedrock of a historical record that cracks a little more every time someone asks the questions they were told not to ask. So keep asking, keep pulling at the threads, keep looking at the maps, the bones, the stones, and the stories that every culture on Earth told their children about who came before.
The truth about our origins belongs to every human being alive, and no institution, however powerful, has the right to decide that you cannot handle it. They buried the giants, but they couldn't bury the truth. The story doesn't end here. It only goes deeper. Every video on this channel is another thread pulled from the fabric of a history they never wanted you to find. Hit subscribe because what's coming next will make everything you just watched look like the introduction.